Hello comrade, my name is Brady and I'm a 19th century American historian and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be doing more alternate history hub. You may be asking, didn't he do this video before? Didn't you react to this video before? Yes, and kind of. There was another version of this video that apparently he didn't like and decided to go back and do it again. I think that's cool. We all make mistakes. It's really cool that he went back to make a better version. So this should be a whole lot of fun. Also, at the time, I knew nothing about Soviet history. Still don't know that much, but I just finished a class on Soviet history. So hopefully I'm a little bit more equipped now than I was back then to understand what he's talking about. I still don't know all that much about Trotsky. Oh yeah, the video we're doing is what if Trotsky came to power instead of Stalin, just in case you didn't read the title of this video before clicking in. It should be interesting. I didn't learn a whole lot about Trotsky in that class. He kind of got a shaft. He got the shaft. He is a big what if scenario that I would like to know a little bit more about. His philosophy is something that I don't know as much about in relation to the other major Bolshevik leaders, so this should be cool. I'm excited, and I trust Cynical historian with my life, so this should be good.
Lenin is dead. His death is mourned across the newly formed USSR. But it isn't unexpected. Lenin for the past couple years had suffered through a series of strokes. He knew his time was coming to an end, as did many others. It had been clear that soon somebody was going to take his place. We all know who won. And because we know the type of atrocities that occurred under Stalin, it's been wondered over the past few decades what would have happened had Trotsky taken power instead.
I love the get owned libs thing with Stalin. I didn't know about the Stalin sympathizers online, and I'm not judging anybody's political beliefs in particular. I just thought that didn't really exist. I always thought that was an abstract idea. But when you get into videos where Stalin is the subject matter, where communism is the subject matter, you start to see them more. I don't know how fringe it is these days. I'd imagine it's still pretty fringe, and I can't just judge from the comment sections of related videos, but it's interesting to see manifest in real life.
So longtime fans might be thinking, didn't you do a video about this already? And yeah, I did. But I have a stance on a lot of older videos. They have aged terribly. Oops!
Fair
but now I'm a
enough.
slightly wiser Cody. I have help from Cypher, the cynical historian, who's done some work on Soviet history himself. So before going into such a scenario, we can't simply begin this deviation in some alternate 1924 where, after Lenin dies, Trotsky just takes over instead of Stalin. Some things beforehand need to change.
Okay. This is a good setup.
Old mustache boys simply didn't just take over out of nowhere and steal what was supposedly rightfully Trotsky's. Stalin was a Bolshevik from the very beginning. He rose up the ranks from the street to being personally appointed by Lenin into the general secretary position. Trotsky was a Menshevik until 1917 when he realized they weren't going to win out.
Something I've learned about Stalin that I can kind of appreciate more, he's much more politically savvy than I understood initially. I've always seen things that portray him as a complete idiot, and yeah, he made a lot of decisions that I think are pretty stupid, but I don't think that he is an idiot. I actually can appreciate a little bit more that he was politically savvy. A lot of major political figures that I think get painted as idiots don't get enough credit. You have like Andrew Jackson, and I have to relate it back to American history because it's what I know. But Andrew Jackson, he's like bashed as illiterate and stuff, but he was also very politically savvy, much more than he was given credit for at times, especially by his detractors.
So one major change needs to occur for Trotsky to even come close to taking control instead of Stalin. Lenin himself needs to vocally support Trotsky consistently and often.
That's an interesting thought here. Like I said, I didn't learn that much about Trotsky in that class. I know some of you have told me in the comments, and I don't know how true this is. Comments are comments or whatever. But a lot of you are really smart. I've heard that Trotsky and Lenin had some major disagreements. They've had their spats here and there. So this may be a little bit of a stretch for Lenin, but I've noticed that in Soviet history with the Bolsheviks, there are people who are willing to compromise a little bit on their philosophy when the existence of the Soviet Union is on the line. That is one of the things. Like, if you don't have the Soviet Union, you don't have your ideal future. We have some pragmatic elements that do step in. When you have the new economic policy at the beginning of the century, I thought that was very interesting. It's not exactly a perfect hybrid system of capitalism and communism, but it allows some of those capitalist elements to come in because economically they need it, because capitalism is good for building capital.
Which, and that's quite the thing to imagine. Trotsky was just one of a couple who were in a position to take over once Lenin kicked the bucket, and out of them, Stalin was the only one with real political power, while Trotsky went off to write or do some on-the-ground activity. While Trotsky was successful as a military leader and intellectual during the revolution, that didn't translate into automatic political success in the head Soviet. And to be blunt, he wasn't really well liked. He was extremely opinionated, even by leftist revolutionary standards, and his general ideology didn't mesh well with the politics that were forming in Moscow.
That gives me a good image of Trotsky, because I've known plenty of political figures throughout history kind of like that. When you find people who really rise to power, sometimes you will get the extremists, but most of the time you'll get somebody a little bit more in the middle that more people can stomach, that more people can swallow their ideology. You'll end up with a lot of boring leaders that way, but that tends to happen. People like Trotsky wouldn't really succeed that well in, let's say, a democratic system. He might have like his strong support here, but being, I guess, such a fire breather would be a little difficult.
And that's the main change that happens in this alternate timeline. Somehow Stalin just doesn't play his cards right, and Lenin is much more vocal that Stalin should not be in charge. The only evidence we do have of a massive split between Lenin and Stalin
Plane's going overhead.
was the letter called Lenin's Testament, which called on Stalin to be removed from power. The authenticity of this letter is disputed, but even if it was faked, this piece of paper with Lenin's name on it held so much political influence, it was still a threat to Stalin's position.
I heard about this paper. I've seen plenty of things on this where it's like, just don't let Stalin be in charge. Whatever you do. I assume this is the same paper that I've heard about. I didn't know that its authenticity was in question. So that's new to me.
So somehow Lenin, without a doubt before his stroke, politically ruined Stalin. That would have led to new candidates being available to take his place. Even with that unlikely scenario occurring, Trotsky needs to gain enough allies with the Central Soviet to be even considered to lead the party, which during 1922 and 24, Trotsky was certainly beaten back during sessions of the Soviet Congress by the majority. How effective this alternate Lenin approval of Trotsky would be, I don't know. I will be honest, this is flimsy, but it's the best chance Trotsky would have.
So basically what he's saying is this would never happen. Some of these alternate history scenarios, we just have to recognize that they're historical fiction. They would never actually happen, and not to take them too seriously. But you are willing to suspend your disbelief on one element just to kind of have that that intellectual exercise, which I think can be a lot of fun. So I think there's a lot of value in this stuff. And I always try to affirm that when I check out alternate history stuff, because there's a lot of people who don't like messing around with this stuff. They really like being in the realm of hard facts and don't really want to deal with what ifs. They want to deal with just what.
Trotsky actually had a lot of power for a while, but specifically in the military. He was the leader of the Red Army and Navy until 1925. So he was in charge of fighting the Russian Civil War and interventionist forces, which included the United States and Britain, putting down several uprisings such as Kronstadt, and all the various invasions of the time, which were Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, Georgia.
That thing with the United States coming in during this time, that was something that was kind of understated, and it was in a Cynical historian video where I learned about that. That was something that just never crossed my senses. I never heard anything about that, and I found it in a Cynical historian video, and he even sent me a paper he did on the subject, which I thought was really cool. I haven't read it yet. I'm sorry. I will get around to it. It's on my desktop, I promise you.
Azerbaijan, Armenia, Poland, and Finland. He was a pretty busy guy, but still found time to write profusely, including trying to justify the Red Terror, which was when the Bolshevik secret police, called the Cheka, suppressed dissent through state terrorism and mass executions, including sending people to work camps, though they weren't called gulags yet. No wonder why he wasn't well liked, even by the party establishment. Hence, when he formed his own faction called the Left Opposition in 1923, he further alienated himself until finally being voted out of the Central Committee in 1927 and expelled from the Soviet Union a year later. When you're considered too radical by Bolsheviks, you know it'd be difficult for Trotsky to take power.
So, yeah, it's not happening. There are extreme circumstances under which somebody like Trotsky can take power. However, I think during this time, people are looking a little bit more for stability. They've been living in a world where the new economic policy has existed for a minute. They're trying to stabilize here. You don't really want somebody like Trotsky, even if he was willing to moderate some of his beliefs, I guess just on the face of it, he would look like a bad representative of what you're trying to do. Okay.
If by some miracle Trotsky becomes the successor to Lenin, his first years in office would be shaky politically. Like I said, Stalin was always a Bolshevik and knew how to gain allies. Trotsky wouldn't be as successful on this front. Now, he could probably have survived this. He was not one to shy away from using secret police and violence to sway opposition, just like Stalin did. And he would most likely use such methods to slowly rework the system from the inside.
This makes me wonder, and we hear about what happened to Trotsky. He lives in exile, and eventually he's taken care of. So I'm starting to wonder maybe if he would see Stalin as a threat in this situation. If the tables are turned, is he going to act the same way? He's going to clearly act out against a lot of people, but will it come back to bite Stalin? And I think in this scenario, that's something that people would be curious about.
Which would translate into transforming what the party could become. From his exile, Trotsky's main criticism of Stalin's government was its brutish egotism. Party officials making decisions on matters they really had no experience in. A system that would define the culture of the USSR even after Stalin's death. Trotsky was a strange contradiction of ideological fanaticism, but also pragmatism.
One thing that I noticed about the early leadership, they were intellectuals, but not necessarily in a lot of the stuff that they were trying to implement. They wanted to get some sort of an industry boom. We don't have like engineers on this board here. While they're intellectuals, we don't have a whole lot of economists on there who can really work this out practically. So I can see a problem here.
Believing the Communist Party shouldn't need to have an opinion on every matter for the nation to be a socialist state. It could, in some areas, delegate matters to experts. He did this during the Civil War, bringing in old Tsarist officers to train Red Army regiments. The Old Guard, in his mind, had some use in its knowledge, especially when it came to economics within the Soviet Union. He felt like those with more experience in those fields would be useful instead of party officials. So this alternate Soviet Union would ironically hire bourgeoisie experts to figure out how to balance the budget, trade, and most importantly, agriculture.
That is something that I noticed in Lenin. While a lot of these early... And there was a book I was... oh, it's right here. I had this book I was doing a paper with. It's about it's Technology and Society under Lenin and Stalin by something Bales. I don't remember what the first name was. I could open the book, but there was something interesting when they were, I guess, trying to create a new generation of like technical intelligentsia. For lack of better term, they wanted to have new people step into these roles of like industrialization and stuff. But they, at the time, were dependent on an old generation that came up during the Tsarist period. So they are kind of inherently bourgeois. So Lenin kind of had to compromise on that. Stalin eventually is going to try to replace them, and he's going to try to like basically put engineer students on a conveyor belt and try to churn them out as quickly as possible, which is a bit difficult.
Trotsky would aim for a party separated from economic affairs, and much like Lenin, would allow some forms of private industry in local areas to help facilitate economic growth on the small scale. While this does seem weirdly contradictory for a more ideological state, to Trotsky, the party still would hold the final decision in such areas. As long as the worker class and unions remain fully in charge, the Soviet Union, to Trotsky, would maintain itself as a socialist state. So if the state doesn't fully include itself in economic matters, then what does it focus its attention on? Trotsky believed that a constant renewal of revolutionary fervor was good, and this was what he saw as the main responsibility of the party. The party would be the ideological generator for the nation. So to
Oh wait, hold on.
be
I
the
didn't catch that.
ideological generator for the nation.
So basically, it wouldn't do much outside of cheering on ideology. That's weird. Something about that doesn't feel right. I wonder if he could maintain his consistency on that, because you have him writing some stuff like from the outside, but once he's in that position to make those calls, what does that power do to him? Because I don't really trust that very many people are uncorruptible. So I don't know. It seems kind of nice in theory that they kind of are a little bit more hands-off compared to what we get under Stalin during certain periods, but I don't know. It doesn't seem practical.
So, to get this out of the way, the Gulag system still exists as political prisoners are put into camps. But this wasn't really anything new or unique. The Russian Empire had been deporting and sending political enemies into Siberia for years.
Lovely.
And it's likely, even had the White Army won the Civil War, the Gulag still would be used. Trotsky was an ideological purist, even constantly shifting his own purity over the years. And I could imagine him arresting and deporting many more people for being enemies of the revolution than Stalin did.
I guess with his extreme nature, that only makes sense that he would be even more strict about who would go to that. Okay, that makes a whole lot of sense. When I heard the idea of Trotsky being in charge, it sounded more appealing because you look at Stalin and he's Stalin. He doesn't have the best reputation. Trotsky, a little lesser known, so I thought, like, how could he be worse? But in some ways, he has the potential to be worse.
This alternate Trotskyist USSR is an ideologically fanatical state, just like the man himself. So I feel this needed to be focused on at some point. But what of the Holodomor? The Holodomor, for context, was the mass starvation that took place in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. And one of the main questions when imagining Stalin never coming to power is, would this still happen? Yes, just not as extreme. Within the peasants, there was an upper class of landowners that hired labor to work their land, known as kulaks. As the kulaks were certainly not happy about the whole collectivizing thing, this discontent led to the Soviets labeling them as enemies of the revolution.
Yeah, kulak, it became kind of a boogeyman, and a lot of people who get deported as kulaks, they don't really, it's kind of a term that's vague enough. You could really stick it on so many different people that it, by definition, doesn't seem like it would fit on. There are people kind of in fear of being labeled as kulaks. So that is something that I have learned a little bit about, and it's very interesting to see how the state uses the idea of kulaks to divide people during collectivization when they're trying to take these individual farms and turn them into collective farms.
And encouraging the lower class of peasants to rise up against them. The Soviets would have cracked down on the kulaks no matter what. Trotsky was actually a main proponent in punishing the kulaks, and from his exile was shocked that Stalin went through with the plan, though he disagreed on the methods, which is really a common theme with Trotsky. The intentions are good, but I never would have done it that way. So this alternate USSR still sees the kulaks punished. What really caused the Holodomor wasn't simply these factors. It was Stalin's export of Ukrainian grain to other parts of Europe, and his crackdown to make sure no news of the famine came out. I don't imagine Trotsky would do the same approach. He was against any trade with capitalist nations, so he wouldn't need to sell off any grain. The main change is that there are resources and food that could be shared, and under Trotsky they would remain within Ukraine.
Yeah, for this, the idea of self-sufficiency is so ingrained in Soviet ideals that's actually surprising that Stalin would do that. Even if he's not exactly like as strict as Trotsky is on that's still kind of surprising. That's something I didn't learn too much about. I don't know if we did that chapter in my book, but I don't know. Maybe I just forgot. It was a lot of information over the past few months. Hopefully I'm getting better, though. What is this? It's Intermission.
This video was sponsored by
it's an ad.
Audible.
So with ads, as a lot of you know, I usually kind of watch through them. You can skip through it on my video, but feel bad about it, as I say.
Know it is. I know it is, and that's because it's the best.
I love
place
Audible.
To get audiobooks.
It's my
The
favorite.
one I listened to that especially helped with this research was Trotsky, Downfall of a Revolution.
Oh, I got that book. Haven't read it yet. Haven't listened
There have
to
been
it
many
yet.
dissections and discussions on Trotsky's life and legacy, and this is just one that I felt was a good introduction in exploring the man more. If you want to check it out, click on the link in the description, www.audible.com/althistory, or text althistory to 500-500. Each month, Audible members will now receive one free audiobook and access to a monthly selection of Audible originals. So if you're interested
They don't
in
even do
learning
that
more
anymore.
about Soviet history,
So much has
or just
changed.
listening to audiobooks in any other topic, Use the link in the description to get started.
Now they have the Plus catalog, which is definitely superior, but I kind of miss when I miss the anticipation of seeing what Audible originals they would have every month. Kind of disappoint.
Alright, back to the video. The greatest difference between Trotsky and Stalin was their international policy. Stalin wanted socialism in one state, believing the only way to protect the party was to secure its authority at home. Trotsky believed the only way to protect the party was to expand. A socialist country alone,
there goes another
even
plane.
a state as big as the USSR, would always remain isolated and without many trading opportunities. And so it had to expand its ideological influence. Now I say that with about 50 asterisks. Stalin focused more on securing socialism in the USSR, but it wasn't like he just ignored other communist movements around the world. He expanded Soviet influence outward, especially after World War II. So how would Trotsky be different? Trotsky, for being the intellect that he was, didn't make the smartest decisions when it came to military campaigns outside of the USSR, such as a failed invasion of Poland during the Civil War.
I don't know how accurate this is, but something about Trotsky reminds me of, well, Thomas Jefferson. And I know, weird comparison here, but they both seem like they're driven by ideas. And that's always been something that people have said about TJ, that he was the idea guy. And it didn't always necessarily translate perfectly to practical application. I don't know if anybody who knows Russian history would agree with that, but that's kind of a vibe I'm getting from him. And it's just a vibe. It's not based on anything in particular.
Trotsky's foreign policy is simply less restrained and more aggressive to the outside world, even to the USSR's own detriment. I don't expect a Trotsky with the entire power of the USSR at his disposal to have any less restraint. Unlike Stalin, who anticipated something was coming and built up the military for such a threat, Trotsky would build up the military and immediately attempt to go on the warpath. Throughout the 1920s, large amounts of Soviet equipment and funds would be funneled into neighboring states. First Poland, then Finland. You get the idea. If any of these revolutions failed, then the next stage would occur.
It seems like Trotsky may have... I'm very curious to how he would have weighed into World War II, like what sort of impact he would have there. I feel like having him in charge might change... obviously, it would change the relationship with the Allies a little bit. I'm sure they wouldn't look at the Soviet Union as quite the same under Trotsky, assuming he really kicks into gear from day one. Maybe there's also a possibility that he still does need a little bit of time before this stuff can be kicked into gear, but I don't know.
Military incursion. I don't know when these types of actions would begin, most likely just as soon as Trotsky took charge. Oof. Now, keep in mind, in 1920s to 30s Europe, revolutions did occur, but they always failed because the common civilian either didn't want to take up arms for the revolution or was openly against it. So in all likelihood, Soviet-encouraged revolution would not be successful. It would come by foreign military force. Now, how the scenario plays out entirely depends on how the West reacts to this. Would they simply attempt to avoid war like with Nazi Germany, or instead would they immediately react and build a coalition to beat back the Soviets?
That's the thing. What if Trotsky somehow became the first catalyst for World War II? What if he really... Maybe it happens even earlier because of Trotsky. Maybe he messes... Wasn't there a thing where... And I'm not great with this sort of stuff. Wasn't there a thing where the U.S. were almost allies with Nazi Germany? What if he drove that alliance to exist? Because there's tension between Russia and Germany, so I'd imagine they're going to be very scared of this, and the West seems very wary of Russia at the same time. So if Russia really cranks it up and goes twice as hard, it would. I feel very. I don't feel too bad saying that it would definitely compromise their place among the Allies.
I actually think that it would be the second option. Appeasement of Hitler was not just because the Allied powers didn't want to get into another war, but it was also because there was some faint illusion that Hitler might just stop at the German lands. A Trotsky invasion of Poland, however, would terrify the rest of Europe, already in the midst of anti-communist fears. Well, oh no, we have to rally everyone together in 1930s Europe.
Including Germany?
Britain, France, and now Germany could band together to stop the Soviets.
That's terrifying. That's not
World War II, for as influential its effect on the world was, and as large as it was pretty simple ideologically wise. The Nazis were so terrible they united the communists and Western powers against a common enemy. But most of all, it played out the inevitable end of Nazism. Showed that in many ways it was self-defeating, an inferno that rages for a brief moment but consumes its own fuel. So this is kind of a disturbing premise to think about. What if during the rise of fascism, the Axis didn't actually attack the Allies first? Say Trotsky showed far less restraint than Stalin and preemptively invaded Nazi Germany before Hitler was able to realize Barbarossa or even invade Poland, where the already existing anti-communist sentiment is emboldened as this Trotskyist USSR repeatedly makes ideological calls to attack other nations.
It's hard to believe that somebody would go so hard there. It seems self-destructive, but I don't know what Trotsky's like. So who knows? I don't know exactly where he's going with this, but I'm getting the vibe that he's going to say that Nazi Germany lasts longer because of this, because World War II didn't go the way that it did. Therefore, they're allowed to exist much longer because they're not the I guess getting completely destroyed. They were, everything came down on them at the end of World War II, and if you change the dynamic there, it's just not going to come down on them the same. So, ew.
So to the liberal democracies of Britain and France, all they would see is the Soviets going on the offensive before Germany does. And fearing that the Soviet military might not just stop at Germany. Instead of the common cause being against fascism, it instead would be against the Soviets. The trivialities of their local politics, at least to a 1930s Europe, wouldn't be much of a concern to the Allies. The Nazis, above all else, would be anti-communist. But Trotsky was the type who would preemptively invade, good idea or not, to take down Hitler before Germany ever reveals to the world the true horrors that it would unleash.
I don't know. I don't know if they could. Maybe if they, like, I don't know if you could, like, get the jump on them like that. I don't know if they would be able to just simply take out Nazi Germany and Hitler. I don't know. They have a big, clumsy military, but if they really get ahead of things, I don't know. There's definitely military historians who would know better about how this scenario would play out than myself.
The outcome, nature, and timescale of such a conflict I'm not going to go into much detail on. Perhaps
Sounds
it does
impossible.
end with the Nazis being overthrown, Britain and France being forced to retreat, half of Europe becoming quite similar to what it was after World War II, or maybe the war is far longer and dragged out. Allied forces being able to beat back the Soviets out of Germany after years of fighting, but never able to move into mainland Russia. But even with all their combined power, I still believe it'd be a drawn-out, back-and-forth war in the center of Europe, going on until finally the atomic bomb is developed. Say the bomb is invented, and and the Soviets are beaten back after Moscow and Leningrad face atomic blasts.
One thing I'm curious about is how the other Axis powers would really work into this. Because Germany, in this case, would be with the Allies. So where would Italy and Japan fit into this? Because they're not going to fit on the... they're not going to fit in very well with the communists, I would imagine. So is the Allies going to be much broader than it was before? And if that's the case, I don't know how Russia could possibly stand up to that in the long term. I mean, Russia is a huge place and they'd have so much to defend, but you could attack them from the east and the west, and they'd have so few of the major powers on their side at that point. Maybe they'd be able to absorb some of the nearby nations, but thinking about what they're up against, it's hard to imagine them succeeding for that long.
Or maybe far more cities by the time the war is done. But really, it's up in the air how much a complex, turbulent, alternate war may go. A preemptive Soviet invasion of Nazi Germany may end the reign of Hitler immediately, but it will do one more thing. It will cause fascism to be martyred by the Red Scare.
I mean,
the Soviets demonized for launching such a war by even the liberal democracies of the West. Forever, it will be debated whether Hitler would have actually invaded another nation, or to what extent the Nazis would have done.
And if they don't end up taking Hitler down, there's a good chance he sticks around for a decent amount of time. Makes me wonder if another conflict would arise later on after the conflict with the communists. Are we going to have a separate conflict emerge that more resembles the World War II that we know? Very interesting. I'm liking this one so far.
In our timeline, after failing to unite against Stalin, Trotsky and his supporters were banned from the party and sent into exile. He would bounce around various countries for a few years before finally settling in Mexico.
Yeah.
It was here where he would write criticisms of Stalin's regime from a ranch thousands of miles away, forever talking about how he would have done things differently. However, to be honest, he at one point was always on board with the same ideas that people demonize Stalin for today. In fact, many of Trotsky's criticisms of Stalin was just that he was implementing the policies in the incorrect fashion.
Of course.
And his very specific way of implementing such a plan would have been so much better. In short, he was disliked by his party for a reason, and frankly was a contrarian. Trotsky was Stalin
what a
without
jerk.
the political patience, but with 10 times more zealotry. The type of zealotry that is detrimental and irrational.
Not anything else.
So why does this scenario come up so often in alternate history?
Oh,
This guy has such a myth surrounding him. He fostered it himself before discovering what an ice pick felt like. But a parody account of the Soviet system really drove home this idea that Trotsky could have saved 20th century communism. As we've seen, he was just as prone to inhumanity as Stalin, if not more so. But Orson Welles just had to stick his pen in it. He wrote Animal Farm during World War II, and literally 2 days after the war ended, and the USSR no longer an ally, he released it. The book depicts the Soviet ruling class through an allegory of animals on a farm overthrowing their farmer and the subsequent power struggle to decide how equality is sorted out. Eventually, the pigs come to rule stating that everyone is equal, but some are more equal. There was a glimmer of hope for everyone to actually see a good form of socialism in the Trotsky-like character who eventually gets run off. This is where the myth comes from. Trotsky formed the fourth...
That makes so much more sense now. I know Animal Farm. I kind of like Animal Farm as a general story. I don't know how I would personally treat it in relation to what it's clearly basing this off of. But it's a very interesting story and definitely worth a read, although I'm not sure what you would take out of it.
International after his exile, and it lives on as the standard bearer for what vanguard communism could have been. They're still active and under the guise of Trotsky's supposed promise, often working closely with what came to be known as the New Left. They're so influential that members who oppose the counterculture of the 1960s began their own form of conservatism, now called neocons. So
oh, there we go.
Both sides of current American politics were...
You got Cypher talking about neocons now. Here we go. I mean, we knew it had to go there, but here we go.
Heavily influenced by this myth. Trotsky could sit on the sidelines complaining about Stalin, but when push comes to shove, he was no better. By the way, if you want to hear some more about Soviet history myths, come check out my video on the subject, coming out today too.
I have that video on my Watch Later playlist. We're going to check it out soon.
Had Trotsky been in power, he would have been remembered just as poorly as Stalin was, but he'd be less successful. Not only dooming the USSR, but actually
you're right.
making
I don't even know why that's
fascism
surprising.
martyred within the West. But this is simply one alternate scenario. What do you think would have happened? This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Thanks, Cody. Dude, that one's heavy. And it was long, too. They had that going for it. Yeah, I think I'm going to definitely need more education on this subject. But it's fun to play around with. This semester, I had a whole lot of fun learning a little bit of Soviet history. It was an introduction, and there's definitely more for me there. And I'm more interested in it than I've ever been. So this should be really cool. If anybody has any book recommendations, I'm down. This is definitely something I'm going to be pursuing a little bit more. I don't think it's ever going to be like my main thing, but it might be like a side interest in history. There's so much about Soviet history that's fascinating to me. And I always say this when it comes to learning about that stuff. I've had to unlearn a lot of my assumptions. I can't treat them like America. I can't treat them like other European powers. They are their own thing. So going into it, it was so hard at first because I have things that I naturally think about other European countries or the United States, and those things just can't apply to Russia or the Soviet Union. It's just its own kind of animal. So this was really cool. If you have any other videos on the subject that you want me to check out, leave them in the comment section below. I also started a Discord. You can join that through the link in the description box below or the link on my channel. And that's about it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.